Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square, and welcome to First Draft, where I talk with authors and journalists about their important work and the stories behind them. For years, America has progressed ever so slightly, but there has always been a backlash to that progress. And as my next guest notes in her book, that there has been a common pattern of white rage that has been boiling in America for quite some time. She traces this back to the 1980s in its current form, and she uses the example of the infamous New York City subway shooting of Black teens by Bernie Goetz to illustrate this issue. Heather Ann Thomson is a Pulitzer Prize winning author. She joins me now, and she will be discussing her new book, which is called Fear and Fury, The Reagan Eighties, The Bernie Goetz Shootings, and The Rebirth of White Rage. Heather, thank you so much for being here today.
I'm so glad to be here with you.
Well, congratulations on the book. And so you have been writing about this theme of crime in urban areas and looking at kind of this gritty period of time in the late 70s and early 1980s. So what was it about this particular story that inspired you to write a book about Bernie Goetz? And for those who aren't old enough to remember, can you just talk through what happened with this infamous shooting?
Sure. So, as you noted, I'm a historian, and I have always found myself, perhaps because of my own biography growing up in the city of Detroit, I've always found myself gravitating towards these stories of, uh, you know, racial violence and, urban dislocation and politics, and sort of also to stories that I always kind of suspected that we were not getting the full picture of, in large part because they were horrific acts of violence that were usually told to us from the media or from the perpetrators or from the state, in a sense. And so I've always gravitated towards those stories. And 10 years ago, that took me in the direction of writing about the Attica prison uprising, because we were in the grips of mass incarceration. And I wanted to understand, we still are, of course, but this is when it's really feeling very new to us. And I wanted to understand how did we get there, and what did an uprising behind bars have to do with that? And that was Blood in the Water. And then I was starting to actually write a completely different book, which was about an episode in Philadelphia in 1985, which was the police bombing of two full city blocks that take out a full neighborhood, a Black neighborhood. And I thought, we don't know anything about that. Let me go write about that. And I still will. I'm still knee deep in that project. But meanwhile, the world around us in real time felt like it was really changing. It was clear that Donald Trump was going to get a second term. It hadn't happened yet, but I was sort of reading the tea leaves, this is where it was going. And then meanwhile, there were these extreme moments of white violence, ordinary citizen violence in Charlottesville, Kyle Rittenhouse, going back not so long before that, George Zimmerman with Trayvon Martin, and so forth. And I was like, I just hold up here. I want to figure this out. And I had always known about this shooting in New York City that takes place in 1984. I remembered it personally because I was a grad student at the time, a young mother grad student would come into the city. And I remember being, wow, you mean I could get on the subway and this white loner got on and within seconds has shot four Black teenagers. Never mind that there's all these other passengers on there. And even at the time, I was struck by that because he is celebrated. He is, they call him the Death Wish vigilante. And I thought, you know what? There's something about that moment in the gritty city of the 80s, which it was very much a gritty time in American history. And I thought, let's unpack it. Let's go back. What happened? Who did he shoot? Why did he shoot them? Why was he celebrated? And that all led to Fear and Fury.
So I have to ask you because I'm a Michigander, and I can't help but think about a murder 2 years earlier than that of Vincent Chen uh,
Exactly.
in Detroit, and he was killed in a racially motivated attack by two white auto workers, and this was at the time where there was so much tension about the growing Japanese auto industry. And of course, Detroit is, the home of the UAW. And so everything was kind of colliding there.
Mhm.
It sounds like you probably weren't living in Michigan at the time that that happened. Maybe you were in college, but talk to us about that, because that seems to be another crime of this era and of white
Absolutely.
race.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember that case as well. I grew up in the city of Detroit, and I talk about the Vincent Chin case in Fear and Fury as kind of this broader landscape, that we're talking about New York in this book, but really this is about America.
Mhm.
And the Vincent Chin case was another one of those kind of, wait a minute, up is down, down is up. How is it that these guys can do this in the case of Detroit and completely get away with it? And what is happening in our court system, but more importantly, what is happening in sort of our body public, that so many white people have decided that the only way that they can exist in these spaces is to be armed. They feel completely justified when they act on their rage. And the thing for me as a historian was, it would have been easy to say, well, you know what, that's just white people, or you know what, that's, anybody would have felt the same way. I kind of had this implicit understanding that no, actually, that there was a big period of American history before that, not too long before that, when we felt good as a nation that we were maybe moving in a very different direction, right? That we were going to broaden civil rights, that we were going to provide a safety net for everybody. And then all of a sudden, it's like, no, we're going to completely double down in the opposite direction. And
Mm.
so that took me to the 80s, and to both I think a really wrenching personal story of this event, but also a political story of the Reagan 80s.
Yeah, it's it we really can't talk about the 80s without the backdrop of course, the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, and how there finally was some racial progress with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. But then, as there always is in America, there's a backlash, and that brings us to the 80s. And I was really struck by the fact that, you talk about the fact that, many people in New York were lifelong Democrats, and they had benefited from, the New Deal programs of the 1930s. But there was this feeling of unease with the 1960s and the 1970s, with the Vietnam protest movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement. There was a lot of social upheaval. And, even some of those lifelong Democrats were kind of siding, as you say, with Archie Bunker, the TV character, who was saying, if you liberals go on getting your way, we're all going to hear one big loud flush, and that's the sound of the USA going down the toilet, which is quite an image there that you paint.
Yeah.
So talk to us about this backlash and how that could lead to the uplifting of someone who just killed four people in cold blood.
Yeah. So the funny thing is, I'm sure even people listening to this, the insight, if you will, that there was something about the 1960s and the upheaval of the 60s and the demands made on making the system equitable in the 60s would have alienated certain people who had benefited from that, but they were like, now let's close the door, right? We don't need to have any more welfare for anyone else. Why can't these people get out of public housing? Why can't these people make it the way that we did? That kind of insight to me is, it feels familiar to us, and we know it, and we know it also to be true. But what was so stunning to me actually getting into the story was I didn't appreciate the extent to which that viewpoint And that understanding of the 60s and that understanding of the dislocation that people were feeling in cities was in fact being curated, created, uh,
Mm,
ginned up, and not just for any random purpose, but because this was a society that had been operating under liberal governance, whether you were Republican, whether you were a Democrat, everyone kind of bought into this idea that the government had a responsibility to take care of its people. You know, the government had a job to do for everybody, and it was going to take taxes to pay for things like public schools and roads and food safety and public hospitals. And so the thing is, really rich people who tended to be Republicans, but not exclusively, they were like, they never liked this. They had been pushing back against the New Deal from the beginning. And so,
mhm,
what the 60s does that I didn't fully appreciate is it gives this opening. It gives this wedge opening to translate what's going on to people in a very, very inflammatory and racialized way. And what's
mm,
going on is the end of the 70s, there is a fiscal collapse globally. I mean,
mm,
everyone remembers the gas crisis of the 70s of a certain age, or, you know, the recession of the 70s. Well, that was a global recession. It was one that would repair, it would actually, you know, rebound across the globe. But that combination, civil rights activism here, a fiscal crisis that is global but is playing out in cities like Detroit, like Chicago, New York City. And Republicans, particularly the Reagan administration, was masterful at connecting those dots and sort of saying, look, the misery you are feeling is because of liberal governance. The solution is to cut taxes for rich people, strip away the public sector, and that's because the people partaking in the public sector are morally bankrupt, they're criminals, they're thugs, we shouldn't support them anymore. But it was brilliant because they understood actually that ordinary people, everyday people still needed those things, right? They still
mm,
needed a tax structure that would support regular people. But everybody's eye is on a completely different ball now. And
mm,
this story about this one shooting shows how the combination of the political sphere, Reagan, all of these guys, and the media, Rupert Murdoch, who will go on to be Fox News, everybody is working overtime to make the 80s this changing moment that will eventually lead us where we are today.
It seems like crime was a really potent issue for Reagan, for Republicans, and clearly we see that that again is an issue that Donald Trump pushed, especially in the last election. And growing up in the as a child in the 80s, I remember newscasts were just I grew up in Chicago. Every newscast was about the latest horrific crime or murder, and I grew up thinking that that was just what life was.
Yeah.
And cities were just full of crime. I lived in an inner ring suburb, and I was Chicago all the time, but I had this image that there was New York was a cesspool, and there were parts of Chicago I could never go to. And, that was, I think, a formative experience for a lot of white people in the 80s. And I feel like there's a clear racial subtext, but the genius of it was that you didn't have to say it explicitly. Everybody knew what you meant. Talk to us about how crime has continued to be such a potent issue for conservatives and has kind of helped with their greater agenda, which is shrinking the public sector.
hmm Yeah, I mean, I will just begin by saying and acknowledging upfront that crime is real. Um, People get victimized all the time. In the 80s, I personally can remember, as I'm sure you can, that, people got mugged. Uh, People's homes were broken into. It was a very stressful time in America because crime was on the rise.
Right.
And so we have to kind of begin there, because a lot of my a lot of the feedback I'll often get, people say, yeah, but crime was real. Yes, it was real. It was
Mhm.
real. If you rode on the subways in Chicago or in New York City, there was graffiti everywhere. There was a sense of unease when you got on, like you're not quite sure whether someone, is anyone watching what's going on here? Am I okay? And if you're white, that feeling is particularly acute because of all these deeply built in ways in which white people are raised, who to fear. That said, what you mentioned at the end there is so critical, because the reason why crime is escalating, the reason why things are getting so bad, is because in 1980, as soon as the Reagan administration takes power, they begin to overhaul the tax code. And this is going to have a dramatic effect on the ground. So things like, for example, young teenagers in Chicago, in Detroit, in New York City were being hired from something called CETA jobs. These were like government internships that would allow teenagers to be hired in the summer, like by Ford Motor Company, and then those would turn into real jobs. It's just one example.
Right.
Completely eradicated. Public sector jobs were mostly held by people that lived in cities, and this is, the public sector employed more Black folks than any other sector. Jobs are drying up for them. And so what do people do? They have to get income. They have to feed their families. So the illegal trades in drugs, particularly, which then escalates, which then creates drug addiction. Meanwhile, we have a public health crisis as a result of that too, AIDS. But we are drying up every resource to help this. There's no jobs. Their public rec centers are shuttering their doors. The libraries are closing. You may remember, I remember this in Detroit. All the public branch libraries were closing. You couldn't
Right.
even go to the library anymore. Public parks are closing. There's nobody there cleaning them. The trash is piling up in the city, right? Because so it isn't just that there was crime, it is that the crime is as a result of real policy and real structural changes. But everybody's eye is not on that, or on the fact, frankly, that rich people are getting richer. In fact, we love it. Do you remember we would watch like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous?
Right.
Dynasty.
And Dallas and all that. A lot of wealth worship in the 80s.
Oh, greed is good. We all wanted to be Alexis Carrington, right? Like we all wanted to have that kind of, we wanted to live on Fifth Avenue, not understanding that was giving license to an accumulation of wealth and a movement towards inequality in this country that will come of age with Donald Trump, but he does not create it. He just lifts the veil on it, so that today we have more income inequality than since the Gilded Age. And meanwhile, but not coincidentally, we are unleashing, legitimizing vigilante violence like we haven't done since the Jim Crow era. And just like back then, right now, those things are they're needed together. So look at Minneapolis, right? It is so off the chain now that nobody's safe, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who you are, because if you are a critic of the system in any way, whiteness doesn't even protect you. And that, one does wonder whether that will be a turning point.
Yeah. I do want to ask you about the issue of crime today, because
I'm sorry, I got derailed.
I want to talk about Minneapolis. I want to talk about the progression of white rage leading to that. But just to close the loop, because crime is still a potent issue, but we have nowhere near the level of violent crime that we did in the 80s during the era of Bernie Goetz. And yet people's perception in polling is that it is still that high. How has this myth been maintained, and how do you feel like it's been effectively exploited? I see a new means to promote this through social media. You know,
Yeah.
for instance, on X, formerly Twitter, there is so much violence on there, and your perception of what's going on in cities, you would think that it's nonstop violent fights and murders based on just the
Mhm.
horrific videos that show on loop.
Yeah. Assuming that those videos are even accurate, right? Assuming that what we're seeing is not itself been distorted.
Right.
Um, it is fascinating that one of the things about the crime rate, this is a little bit of a segue, but really important to what you just asked. The crime rate in American history, it is absolutely tethered to the economy, but it
Mm,
also has its kind of own life. I mean, it goes up, it goes down, depending on place, space. So for certain spaces in American history, which tend to be the ones where middle class and wealthy people live, the crime rate is really non-existent. And that's one of the reasons why people want to live in those spaces, right? Because they understand that having resources makes spaces safer.
mhm.
Meanwhile, in other spaces, there's still a terrible amount of crime because those are the spaces that have been completely stripped of everything they need to operate. So we have a weird crime situation now where crime is segmented in a really kind of profound way. So that's important. But the other thing is, remember, we were talking about how the shining putting people's minds at watch what's happening over here, don't watch what's happening here with the economy. The way to do that was through not just a sensationalistic media, but it was through a misinformation media that I think the book also really locates in this time of this shooting, in this shooting.
Mm,
So today, we are now at the point where up is down and down is up, and we can be told one thing or shown one thing and be told the truth about it or the actual facts about it, and it doesn't matter. People have a complete mistrust of what the truth is. Actually, they doubt that there is a truth in the hands of uh, anybody.
mm,
And so this is again the ultimate expression. We can have a Minneapolis example, which is a crime, by the way, when you pull out a gun and you shoot someone who's not wielding a weapon at you, especially if they are allowed to carry legally. You just committed a crime. But what is up and what is down is who's the criminal. The
mm.
criminal is the one on the ground being shot. And that up is down and down is up narrative, we can also trace to this period of the 80s. So crime is potent in part because it is what we now say it is, right?
Mhm.
Crime is not Kyle Rittenhouse carrying a gun and gunning down people. Crime is the observer of an ICE raid who's on the ground with his cell phone. But that's a narrative that we are already kind of subject to believing.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Minneapolis because obviously, so there have been three murders in the city since the beginning of the year. Two of them were committed by federal agents,
Yeah.
killing first Renee Good and then Alex Preddy on Saturday. Um, these crimes have really, I think, shaken the nation's conscience. But you do see these dynamics where, in spite of there being video of the shooting of Alex Preddy from every angle, the Trump administration, at least initially, was insisting that he was a domestic terrorist, that he was wielding a weapon, that he was trying to massacre federal agents,
That
and
he
they
was
were
Latino, that he had a completely different name.
and they put out this narrative that started to fall apart, even among many of their own supporters who, you know, are very proudly pro Second Amendment. Um, do you see that this is part of kind of that continuation of this theme of white rage and of they can kind of be traced back to the
Mhm.
80s?
Absolutely. Just to go to the story at the heart of the book that I so hope people will read, because it is it is where this all kind of gets started. Bernie gets not only shoots these four teenagers and they become the villains and he becomes the hero, they also get kind of erased from the story. And that process of erasing them from the story was so important to the him being able to be a hero. So pretty soon what he did was what he said he did. Oh wait, no, he admitted to doing everything.
Hmm.
So in this very long, lengthy video confession, but then we're told that he didn't mean it, that he didn't say what he said. So if you're interested, in kind of how up becomes down and down becomes up, I invite you to this story because it is told in narrative fashion. We've been speaking kind of like high level politics here, but it's really told kind of unfolding, and you can see how this gets rooted. But I will say that Minneapolis is also instructive in a way that it took me a minute to kind of, ooh, duh, putting it together. The two people that were killed most recently were white. But
Right.
of course, ICE has killed how many now? 11, 12, including one man in Minneapolis who was not white, I understand. And so we don't know their names.
Right.
And we have already kind of we no, good-hearted and people with good intentions trying to report what is real. We as a nation don't get worried about this unless it starts to impact white people and
Right.
starts to impact people that looks like our children or our sister or our brother or our father. And so one of the things I think the Republican Party is very nervous about right now is that can be a tipping point. It
Mhm.
isn't just about the Second Amendment, even though it's significant that the NRA that supported Bernie Goetz and funded his legal defense fund is like, wait a minute, what about the Second Amendment? I mean, that matters. But
Mhm.
I wonder if what matters more is that people see Alex Preddy and they say, that's my son,
Right.
or that is my husband, or they look at Renee Good and they're like, Jesus, that's my daughter, or she was a mother, right?
Yeah.
And we just, there are lines that the erosion of our moral compass has not quite become complete, because I think that people are alarmed by that, but we must never forget the racial underpinnings of it, because the minute the Trump administration could pivot totally, stop killing white people, uh, stop killing citizens, and we're still going to have all of those children in detention centers.
Right.
So yeah, it's both hopeful and scary at the same time, I feel like.
And, to your point about the Bernie Goetz case in particular, I'm struck by the fact that very few of us even remember or know the names, the four teens who were killed, and their names are Daryl Katie, Barry Allen, Troy Canty, and James Ramseur. And I can't help but think of the parallel with the Central Park Five and our current president. That was a huge issue for him in the 80s. He ran an ad calling for them to get the death penalty. And of course, in that particular case, those five young men were not guilty. And yet he before long before he was elected president, but as someone who is a mainstay in the media and considered to be a real estate mogul, a very prominent member of New York
People
society,
admired.
right? You had Trump the board game and all of that. He wanted to play judge, jury, and executioner, for a case that also had huge racial underpinnings. And I feel was similar in the 80s of kind of defining this, the issue of crime and race. Um,
Absolutely.
do you talk to us about how I want to talk a little bit about how we get from there with Donald Trump, the media figure who makes a big splash and tries to get headlines in, a very disgusting way. And now he's the one who is making policy. And it's his policy that has resulted in Alex Preddy and Renee Good and many others who we don't know their names in their deaths with his policies right now.
The most kind of stunning thing about the Trump story, and there's so many books about it right now. There's so many stories about the rise of Trump. But the thing that I don't think they fully capture is that in the 80s, he wasn't a political figure the way we think of at all. He was, in fact, a media figure. He is the showman. He would be on the front pages of the New York Post with his, wife, Ivanka, and the glitz and the glamour of their lifestyle. And then he would have an affair, and then that would be all over the tabloids. And he would meanwhile be building these fabulous casinos and fabulous buildings in New York City. And so he is this larger than life figure, but behind the scenes, he was always flirting with politics because he was always flirting with power.
Right.
So he courted the White House that was Reagan. He tried to court the Clinton White House. For a time, he was in the party of Ross Perot. He would try on political identities depending on what he thought was the flavor of the hour. But what he was always savvy about was watching closely, particularly publications like the New York Post, and what is selling? What do people want to see? What do they want to hear? And so he decides he needs to have a national political presence. So this is being on The Apprentice, being on Worldwide Wrestling, getting a board game, selling a book, The Art of the Deal, and all this stuff. He wants to get a national footprint, but he still doesn't have a political footprint. And the genius of him is that he is so closely reading these tea leaves. Also, he doesn't care about the truth. So again, you can do whatever you want to do, including like pretend like you're someone else on the telephone to get a media interview or whatever. But he quickly realizes that episodes like the Bernie Goetz case, episodes like the Central Park now exonerated 5, these episodes, Howard Beach, where a white mob of teenagers kills a young Black person, Bensonhurst, same thing. He watches these, he watches the mood. He says, the white working class voter is my voter, but I got to play this exactly right. And his moment came with the Obama administration. And he knew it. And by then, the Fox News network is huge. And he starts to go on Fox day after day after day. He is on there so much leading up to both of his elections. And this, and saying whatever he wants, starting with, Barack Obama isn't even American and all this kind of stuff. So when you trace it, Trump is not like, he didn't just kind of like, rise to power slowly and this is his hour. He sees what the hour is and says, those are my people. But meanwhile, and this is what I don't think we spend enough time talking about, he has concentrated wealth more than any other president. He has cemented the long Reagan revolution in a way that Reagan himself would not have dared to do.
Yes.
The corruption, the tax breaks. But again, shiny penny, we aren't looking at that, right? We are looking at Minneapolis now. We are looking at the border crisis. We are looking at these things. And, I hope this book will kind of just, for no matter what people's political persuasion, is just like, let's just go back a little bit to the moment where this quilt gets sewn together. And I have to say, I'm a pretty jaded person. American history will make you jaded. I was stunned by quite a bit of the things that ended up in this book.
It's fascinating that you make the point that Donald Trump decided that working class white voters were his voters. And, but to your point, they've really gotten so little out of either of his presidencies because his policies have all been aimed at the ultra wealthy. in the latest tax bill that Congress passed last summer, I mean, there's not even, any kind of a fig leaf where middle class families get anything, which used to be the case like under George W. Bush. He's just done away with that completely. He's building $250 million ballrooms in the White House with gold leaf everywhere. And meanwhile, it seems like what all he's really offering these voters is just racial
Anger,
and anger.
anger.
And you can see that, if, when I was watching January 6th, 2021, like all of us were, I was watching it with my teenage children, and I never thought that I would be sitting there watching the nation of our capital desecrated, but just the white rage I felt like was on full display. And we've seen it. I can see, the through line for Bernie Goetz, for people like Kyle Rittenhouse or Dylan Roof, who, murdered Black parishioners right there in their own church after praying with them. When all you're offering people is anger and you're not offering them anything else, where does that leave us as a society?
Well, I'll tell you, it's making even rich people nervous, I think, because across the party divide, people are, if you have money, there's not a lot of criticism of what's happened with the tax code. There's not a lot of criticism about why there is not, anything left for anybody else. But rich people are also savvy, and they are getting nervous. If you don't have any crumbs for anybody, then there's only one way you're going to rule. There's only one way you're going to have order in your society, and that's going to be through violence. It's going to be through one of the largest ICE budgets we've ever seen. It's going to be with, getting rid of habeas corpus, getting rid of, no-knock warrants, like, or doubling down on them, I should say. And, you just said it, like, where does that leave us as a nation? Where does that leave us when we don't have any rule of law anymore, and we don't have a moral compass anymore, and we, only one of two things happen in those societies. Either they eventually have revolutions, and I don't use that term, either pejoratively or overly dramatically. I mean, I just speak factually, right? You either have an eruption from below, where people, wake up, smell the coffee, and make alliances with people whom they thought they hated, or you have a society that is a dictatorship that is run with the iron hand of guns and terror, and so I think the rich people would probably be okay either way, because they can have their gated communities, and they can live in tall towers, and they can have private police forces. So they're going to be okay either way. But it is still a fall from grace. It is still a disappointment when the entire world hates you. And for ordinary people, I think maybe Minneapolis is waking up people to the fact that, if they can shoot Alex Breddy in the head, they can shoot anyone in the head. If they can go into it, Renee Good's car without cause, they can go in your car without cause. We will see. I am personally hopeful. Like, I look at New York City, I look at this Mamdani moment, and I think, you know what? That's the same city that birthed Bernie Goetz, and people are like, no, hatred does not put food on my table. Rage does not, heat my apartment. So they're kind of feeling done with that. But on the other hand, I think I share the nation's deep concern that, if there is no rule of law, we could have an election and he won't leave. And if he has the military, and if he has ICE, and if he has all of these things, then who's going to make him leave? And we're in a real changing time, I think. And I'm just hoping that we can take a moment to understand a little bit of how we got here, because people don't want to be duped.
Mhm.
They don't want to be lied to. They don't want to be manipulated. I don't, working class people aren't stupid people. Working class people, it's my family too. Like people aren't stupid. People are good-hearted. They love their families. They love their country. Like, so to wake up and say, Jesus, like, why was this handed to me the way it was? I think people will get mad, frankly. I think they'll get angry, but in a different direction.
Hmm. Well, Heather, before we go, can you share with us maybe one thing from your book that people may find surprising about the Bernie Goetz murder, or anything else that you wrote about?
Mm. Well, I hope that what people will find surprising is the story of the 4 teenagers that he killed. I am embarrassed to say I also did not know who they were. And this is, I remember the event and I didn't know who they were. So I took a lot of time to try to reconstruct the story of who these people were and what the costs of this moment were in their lived lives. He permanently paralyzed one of the teenagers, who's kind of the center of the story, but also you learn about his friends. So I hope that's a surprise in a moving way or in a humanizing way. But I think that people will be most surprised by the familiarity of what we just saw something, we're being told something else just happened,
Mm,
and you're going to see it play out in real time and how it's done. And I think that that is a surprise. I think
mhm.
people will it was 50 years ago almost. Well, if 40 some years ago, and I think people will be surprised by, wow, that's where we got really good at this. That's where we started to sow these seeds, and because that surprised me for sure.
Heather, thank you for being here. You should definitely pick up her new book. It's called Fear and Fury. It's out now. Thank you for taking so much time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much for allowing me to share this.